Now, let's put that up there. And that goes up there like that. Perfect. Excellent. Now, I need my advancer. There we go. Well, as Alan said, I started doing family history about 10 years ago. My dad had been doing it for a long time, and I joined the fray. And within a fairly short period of time, we managed to get a few extra generations in our family tree. Pushed it back another generation or so on some of the lines, not all of the lines, because there are so many records now available online, so many records are being digitized that it's becoming easier and easier to do your family tree research from the comfort of your own home. But we reached those brick walls, and that's when I came across a DNA test by National Geographic, and I thought, that's interesting. Now, it's not going to maybe help me break through some brick walls, because the nature of the National Geographic test is that it's mainly to study human migrations. But I thought I'd like to know where I came from, my deep ancestry, so I went and I bought the test. And then I thought, actually, I'm hopeless at Christmas presents, and this would make a great Christmas present for my dad. Why don't I give it to my dad? Because I got my Y DNA from my dad. It passes from father to son. So his Y DNA is going to be exactly the same as my Y DNA. Hopefully. That's when the panic set in. Because supposing I was swapped at birth, supposing I was a secret adoption, how did I actually know that my dad was my dad? But I took the risk anyway, and I gave him the DNA test, and I'll show you some of the results over the course of the next hour or so. Excuse me. So here is an example of my brick walls. Now, this is probably very similar to what you have done in your family tree research. How many people here are actually researching their family trees? Okay, so that's practically everybody. And how anybody has done a DNA test? There's a few people have done a DNA test, about 10 people or so. And how many people are thinking of doing a DNA test? Okay, a whole lot more, so that's all very, very good. Well, your family trees are probably something like this. I've identified about 50% of my great-great-grandparents. The other 50% I'm either not sure, or I have a candidate, but I cannot be sure that it's that person. And that's after exhausting family lore, letters in the attic, the family Bible, the 1901 and 1911 censuses, Griffith's valuation, and the cancelled books that followed Griffith's valuation every 2 years, another valuation. And that's been very, very helpful in breaking the brick wall in one or two of my ancestral lines. Birth, marriages, and deaths associated with civil registration from 1845 onwards. And then the church records, which probably go back to about 1800 in most cases. Very little chance of them going back much further than that. And then, of course, collaboration with other people by using websites like Genes Reunited, Ancestry, MyHeritage, RootsWeb, putting the family tree up on the internet, privatizing the living people, and hopefully somebody out there finds it and says, oh, I think we're related via your Gleason line, or your Hart line, or your Union line. I've got Union as a surname in my family tree. Has anybody got any Union cousins or relatives out there?
Onion.
Onions, I think they might be related to onions, yeah. Union sounds very important, but I think they were onion makers, or onion pickers of some sort. But yeah, so the unions and the onions could be related. And having the family tree up on the internet is a very, very useful way of collaborating with other people. And then, particularly for people in Dublin, Glasnevin Cemetery has excellent records, and that brings me back to 1832 and even into the 1700s. With more newspapers becoming available online, and with the electoral rolls, it's making it easier to. These are also very useful ways of identifying ancestors. Now, but apart from that, you end up with this brick wall here, around about 1800. And what I've managed to do with DNA is break through that brick wall with one particular line of my ancestors, and that has brought me back to the early 1700s, late 1600s, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about that later on. So that is the power of DNA. It can actually help you break through the brick walls in your family tree research. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of DNA, I want to take you back 16,000 years to when Ireland and England were part of one large landmass, and to the northeast of England there was a huge area called Doggerland. Now, let me just get rid of that. Okay. Now, Doggerland was this big area here, which went almost up as far as Norway and extended all the way around England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, all the way down to France and Spain. And it connected Ireland and England with continental Europe. Now, the importance of this is that before about 20,000 years ago, the ice sheets covered this entire area, and they were 1 mile thick in places. So the islands of Ireland and Britain have really only been colonized relatively recently. Now, about 16,000 years ago, the ice sheets had retreated to the extent that they uncovered this land called Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, because sea levels were about 120 meters lower than they are today. So there was a lot more land available at that time. And into that land, around about 12,000 years ago, came the first humans, and they settled and made settlements in England. About 8,000 years ago, they moved into Ireland. But all during that time, the sea levels were rising. You can see that, according to the key here, that the light green represents the sea, the coast at 16,000 BC. The slightly darker green is 8,000. And the darkest green, this one here, is about 7,000. Now, this means that there were annual migrations, because a lot of these early migrations were seasonal. So people would come in, and then for the winter they would go away. But about 4,000 years ago, that's when agriculture started coming in, and people started putting down roots and settling in the islands. This was all upset about 6,000 years ago when a large chunk of Norway fell into the sea and caused this tidal wave, which was so fierce it actually penetrated 25 miles inland. And the small number of settlers who were still around the Doggerland area, there were about 5,000 of them, they all would have been wiped out completely. And this is a feature of European history over the centuries. You have these natural disasters. You have the Black Death of 1350, which wiped out 50% of the population. You had the Plague of London of 1665, which wiped out 20% of the population. And we've had nothing like that in recent times, apart from maybe the Spanish flu during the First World War, 1917, 1918, which probably wiped out around about 5 or 6% of the population, which, when you think about it, is still a huge number. But back in those days, natural disasters wiped whole peoples away, whole populations away. And then over the course of time, various people have migrated into Britain. We've had the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and you can see their particular area of distribution there. Also into Ireland. So you had the early settlers around about 8,000 BC, then agriculture 4,000 BC, and then these early settlers mixed with the Celts about 500 BC. And they came in, mixed with the original people that lived on these lands, and formed the tribes and the clans of Ireland. They were joined later on by the Vikings, who invaded from around about 800 to about 1,000 or so. And they were both Norse Vikings in red, settling in northern Scotland, the eastern seaboard of Ireland, the western seaboard of England, and Danish Vikings, which settled largely the eastern part of England and a small part of northeast Ireland. Into that you have the Norman settlers who came in the south of Ireland here, the southeast of Ireland, around about Wexford, and spread throughout the country. Some also came in via Scotland. So you had Normans coming from the south and Normans coming from the north. You then had the Anglo-Irish families. These peoples consolidated into these Anglo-Irish families from the 1400s and the 1500s. The English and Scots coming in from 1500 onwards. And then smaller contributions from the Gallo-Glass, the Huguenot, the Palatine, and in more recent times, Jewish, Spanish, more European people coming in, and now we have also Asian and African. So, what can you get from a DNA test? Well, there's various things, and the first thing is a community of avid genetic genealogists, and I would encourage any of you to join the International Society of Genetic Genealogy. The reason being, it's completely free, it's run by volunteers, and these are people who have been working with DNA, some of them for many, many years, and they are willing and enthusiastic about helping you understand what DNA is all about and how to get the most out of your DNA test. Is it? I don't know if Chris is around. Maybe we could have the lights down. That might help a little bit better. Just the top lights here might be a little bit... does that make it a little bit better for you? A little less worse. Okay. Fine. So a community of avid genetic genealogists, you can get deep ancestry and human migration pathways. You can get information about your ethnic makeup. You can get information about long-lost cousins and what percentage Neanderthal you are, and also a medical risk assessment. So there's actually quite a lot of information that you can get from DNA. Now, I see some of you are taking notes. Please feel free to take notes. Please feel free to take any photographs you want to as well. But I will be making these slides available as a PDF document. And you can get them via the Facebook page of the North of Ireland Family History Society, via the website, or by contacting one of the Ballymena branch members, like Maggie Little, for example. I can nominate her because she's not in the room. So there is an awful lot that you can get from a DNA test. Now, let's look at some of the companies that you can use. Family Tree DNA is probably the best, and the reason why I say that is because they offer a better infrastructure to support you in your ongoing research. Some of the other companies, for example, Britain's DNA, Scotland's DNA, Ireland's DNA, they give you the results, they tell you what your DNA says about you, but they don't compare your DNA to anybody else in the database. So you're not able to connect with distant cousins, for example. Ancestry DNA don't actually give you any information on what the DNA looks like. They just say who you match in their database. Not only that, but you can't actually get the test outside of the US at the moment. So 99% of their database is US-based, whereas only 70% of Family Tree DNA's database is US-based. So you get a lot more European and non-US people in the Family Tree DNA database than you do in the other ones. 23andMe is good if you're interested in doing a medical risk assessment. Unfortunately, the medical risk part of their test has been suspended by the FDA until they have met certain requirements. So when that will be reinstated, we don't know. So at the moment, you cannot actually get a medical risk assessment. So I'm going to focus largely on Family Tree DNA and the various tests that they offer. Just to say that I've brought 100 DNA kits with me today, so if anybody is interested in doing a DNA test, we'll be around here afterwards for about an hour and a half or so, and please do feel free to come forward, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm a volunteer. I don't get anything from Family Tree DNA. What I have been able to do is get a discounted price for anybody testing here tonight on many of the tests. And also, for those of you who are members of the North of Ireland Family History Society, there is a special reduced price on many of the tests that you can avail of over the course of the next month or so. So that's the the DNA kits, and they're available here today. The International Society of Genetic Genealogy, this voluntary organization, you can see that its mission is to advocate for and educate about the use of genetics as a tool for genealogical research and promote a supportive network for genetic genealogists. And they have a website, they have various mailing groups which are very, very useful and supportive. They have a Facebook page, and they also have, there's other DNA Facebook groups available, which are, again, very supportive, and I would encourage you to join them. Now, also, the Family Tree DNA has this infrastructure, like I say, for surname projects, geographical projects, and other types of projects, which we'll talk about briefly, but also, and all of these are run by volunteers. Also, because the volunteers are so interested in encouraging people to do DNA testing, they are offering free DNA tests. So if your name is here on this list, it's quite possible that you will be able to get a free DNA test by contacting the project administrators for any of these projects. Now, does anybody see their name on this list? Okay, 2 people down here, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so there's 6, so there's possibly 6 people who might qualify for a free DNA test that is going to be paid for by the project administrator of these projects. Okay? Come up to me afterwards and we can have a chat if you're interested. In terms of the DNA test itself, it's really very, very simple. It's a simple cheek swab. There's no blood test involved. And here is the person taking the DNA test. It goes into a test tube. That test tube goes into an envelope, and that gets posted off to the lab. Now, in the lab, which is in Texas, they look at your results. They see that there's some DNA in the test tube. They put it through their analyzer, and then they post your results on your personal web page with your own user ID and your password, so only you can get into it. And that's posted up on their website, but it's your personal web page. Not only do they do that, but they also compare your results with the 600,000 results they have in their database. And they try and match your results with all the other results in the database. Those people that match you closely are your genetic cousins, and you share a common ancestor with them. Now, it might be 100 years ago, it might be 1,000 years ago, it might be 2,000 years ago. But what the DNA test actually allows you to do is to identify people with whom you share a common ancestor by matching their DNA. Not only that, but also they allow you to get involved in projects. Unfortunately, it's a little bit off the screen here, but these projects, like I say, are run by project administrators voluntarily, and there's an awful lot of work done by these people. Let's take a little closer look at the DNA that's in that little test tube. Now, what you do when you swab your cheek is you dislodge cheek cells from the inside of your cheek. And here is an average cheek cell, and you might remember from basic biology that you have this large green nucleus here, and these smaller blue things here are called the mitochondria, the batteries of the cell. Now, within the mitochondria, there is a circular piece of DNA called mitochondrial DNA. Now, the relevance of this is that your mitochondrial DNA was passed on to you from your mother, and she got hers from her mother, and she got hers from her mother. So testing your mitochondrial DNA will actually take you back along your mother's line, okay? Inside the nucleus, which is this green thing here, we have 46 chromosomes arranged into 23 pairs. So as human beings, we have 46 chromosomes. Bananas have 8, fruit flies have 12, potatoes have 18, that type of thing. But human beings have 46 chromosomes, and the last of these chromosomes, pair number 23, are known as the sex chromosomes. And these are the chromosomes that determine whether you're a man or a woman. If you're a woman, you have 2 X chromosomes, X and X. If you're a man, you have an X and a Y. Now, the Y chromosome is only about 1/3 of the length of the X chromosome. So what this means is that genetically, Your average man is less of a person than your average woman. Ooh, I know, contentious, but what can we do about it? It's the truth. And people used to think the Y chromosome didn't do anything, but in actual fact, it didn't have any genes on it. But in fact, there's lots of genes on the Y chromosome. For example, here's the gene for the inability to see or hear the obvious. Down here we have the catching and throwing gene, just above the BS gene. Here we have the GOT1 gene, which is the ability to remember and tell jokes. One of my favorites is the DC10 gene, the ability to identify aircraft. So this is what a chromosome looks like when you stretch it out. Normally they're bundled up. And all along the chromosome you'll have these various genes, and all along the chromosome you'll have these markers, which we'll talk about in a while. So that is the Y chromosome as an example. But there are three main types of DNA. Now, the first one is the Y DNA, and we saw that that was one of the sex chromosomes. The Y DNA only gets passed on from father to son to son to son. So if you're a man, you got your Y chromosome from your father, he got it from his father, and he got it from his father. So the Y chromosome will actually take you back along your father's line. Okay? The second type of DNA is the mitochondrial DNA we just mentioned, and that will take you back along your mother's line. And the third type of DNA is called the autosomal DNA, and those are all the other chromosomes in the cell. Okay, you have 46 altogether, 44 chromosomes, then the X and then the Y. The autosomal chromosomes are all of the non-sex chromosomes, so all those 44 other chromosomes in the cell. And they will allow you to look at all of your ancestral lines, not just the one on the far left, and not just the one on the far right. Okay, so they'll help you look at all of your ancestral lines. Now, that means that with the Y DNA you can explore deep ancestry and recent ancestry. With the mitochondrial DNA you can explore deep ancestry and recent ancestry. And with the autosomal DNA, you can only explore recent ancestry. So if you're interested in the migration of your ancestors out of Africa 45,000 years ago, then you'd either go for a Y DNA test or a mitochondrial DNA test. If you're more interested in the last, well, when we say recent ancestry, we really mean in the last 1,000 years, since the introduction of surnames, then you can go for either the Y or the mitochondrial or the autosomal DNA. But the autosomal DNA will only take you back about 250 years. The Y and mitochondrial will take you back much further than that. So those are the three types of DNA. Let's first look at deep ancestry and human migrations. And the Y DNA is frequently the DNA associated with warriors, with invaders. So for example, when the Vikings came on their raids, they didn't bring women with them. They were raiding, they came in and they left, they came in and they left. When they finally started settling, and one of the first Viking settlements in Ireland was in Dublin, the Black Pool, they married local women. So they didn't bring in Viking mitochondrial DNA, they only brought in Viking Y DNA. So if you have got Viking ancestors, you're more likely to see it on the Y DNA side than on the mitochondrial DNA side. The mitochondrial DNA side was more associated with settlers, so the Celts, when they came in and they settled en masse, it would be the mitochondrial DNA that they left in place. And you can see from this diagram here that we can trace the migration of haplogroup R1b, which is the most frequent in Europe, and we'll talk about haplogroups in a while. And most people here in this room would be haplogroup R1b. But you can trace it all the way back to Africa, to Adam. And we can go back currently we can go back about 330,000 years by looking at Y DNA. That's how far the science has progressed. In time, we're probably going to be able to go back even further. The other type of DNA that's used for deep ancestry, of course, is mitochondrial DNA. And this is the other type of diagram you get with these haplogroups, and that's the distribution of the DNA in a particular area. So this is the haplogroup T2b on the mitochondrial side, and you can see that it's very frequent throughout Europe. Now, the reason why we're able to follow the path of human migration out of Africa is because when we have children, we actually make a copy of our DNA and we pass it on to our children. So here's early man standing at his photocopier, and he's made a copy of his DNA, but there's a mistake here. This particular child has a large blue nose, and there's a mistake here. This particular child is very, very small. Now, if this one goes off and decides to explore Outer Mongolia, and this one up here decides to explore South America, then they're going to go off, they're going to have children of their own. Over the generations, more mutations will occur, but they will be very, very different for this chap's descendants than they are for this chap's descendants. And this is what happens. These mutations act as markers, and they kind of leave a paper trail that can be followed by the intrepid scientist all the way across the world. Now, it is the combination of genetics with archaeology and linguistics that is allowing us to trace the migration of humans from Africa into Europe and into other continents as well. And to give you an example of how we can trace this, here is a map of human migrations based on mitochondrial DNA. So these are the women moving across the world. And you can see that they start in East Africa. Some of them develop migration mutations which have evolved into specific genetic signatures, allowing them to be grouped into different haplogroups, L1, L2. But then they move out of Africa, some of them move into Europe, some of them move all the way across to North America, and others move all the way down to South America. And the tip of South America was the last part of the planet to be inhabited by human beings, and that happened about 15,000 years ago. Of course, Europe and probably Ireland and England were inhabited before, but the ice sheets, when they came down during the last ice age, got rid of everything. And then when they receded, like we saw at the beginning about 16,000 years ago, that's when the land became habitable again and humans moved into the forested lands of Doggerland. Here is the deep ancestry of various Y-DNA haplogroups. Like I say, most people in Europe will be R1b, and that accounts for about 80% of people here in the audience today. 15% of people in the audience will be I1, and there's a large concentration of I1 today in Scandinavia, but there's also smaller concentrations in other parts of Europe. So this could be a Viking, the type of genetic signature. A lot of the research is getting published in the next couple of years because we have many more markers to test in the last year or so, and it's going to take a while to actually test people and decide just exactly what the finer branches of this these finer subgroups of the haplogroups are. And that happens with the haplotree. So this is the haplotree. There's Adam there. We call him Adam. He's the person that everybody goes back to from a Y-DNA point of view. And you don't need to read all of this, but just to show that there are various subgroups of the tree. So that various people over time have developed their own unique genetic signature, passed that on to their children. They've migrated to various places around the world, and that has resulted in a haplotree. And that's mapped using SNP markers, and we started off with just 16, and then we had 24, and then in 2010 we increased it to 71, and in 2013 there's more than 290. So you can see that over time, the branches of the human genetic tree are getting finer and finer, and eventually it will reach a stage, probably, where we will be able to connect with the ancient clan genealogies, both in Ireland and in Scotland, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So, And this is actually an example. These haplogroup subgroups are being localized to a particular geographic area. And this is an example of Z253. Now, Z253 is just a particular marker, but it is particularly common in Southern Ireland. And it is associated with these particular surnames. And as more people test, we will be able to narrow down the surnames that are most commonly associated with a particular marker in a particular area. And that will allow us to link to the ancient genealogies. So the annals of the four masters, not just in Ireland, but also in Scotland. So all the various clans in Scotland and all of their ancient genealogies, DNA will eventually allow us to take a test, and then we'll get a result saying, you are related to the Campbell clan. So very exciting, and within the next 5 years or so, this should be a lot more developed. So if you do a DNA test, it's going to be very important for you to join a haplogroup project. So if your results come back and say that you're R1b, make sure you join one of the R1b projects. And there's various ones available on Family Tree DNA. You will be told when you get your results what haplogroup you belong to, and then you just make sure you find that project and join up. It's also important to join a geographical project, and there's various geographical projects available. There's the Ireland Y-DNA, the Munster Irish, the Ulster Heritage Project, which we'll talk about, and the Scots Irish Project. Now, this is the Ulster Heritage Project, and they have more than 2,500 members, okay? So there's loads of surnames from the north of Ireland in this particular project. They have set up their own particular website as well. It's run by two volunteers called Barry McCain and John Kane. And they realized that they were cousins when their DNA results came back. Because even though one was a McCain and the other one was a Kane, their DNA was an exact match. So they got together, they started the Ulster Heritage Project, and this is one of the projects that you should join if you're going to do a DNA test today. This is just to make the point that if you do a Y-DNA test or a mitochondrial DNA test, you're only looking at one line of your family. Father's line, if you're doing a Y-DNA test, mother's line if you're doing a mitochondrial DNA test. If you want to explore the maternal side of your family or the paternal side of your family, you're better off doing an autosomal DNA test, and we were chatting about that earlier on with some people as well. Here's an interesting chap, Professor Henry Louis Gates. The reason why I put him up here is because he's a very good example of how just doing one test doesn't tell you the whole story. So he's an African-American professor. He's done an excellent television series called Finding Your Roots. Some of you may have seen that. Has anyone seen that? No, it's absolutely wonderful. He mixes traditional genealogy with genetic genealogy, and he's got a great website as well. I work with a Jamaican group in Birmingham, and we've started doing DNA testing. And the results are very, very interesting, but his website has been very, very useful in helping us, guiding us on how to interpret the results. But he did his Y-DNA, and his Y-DNA was RM222. And that is the genetic signature of 9 of the 9 hostages. He did his mitochondrial DNA, and that came back as being European. So here is an African-American man who's done a Y-DNA and a mitochondrial DNA test, and it's both gone back to European haplogroups. And that indicates that on his father's line, his ancestor was European, and on his mother's line, his ancestor was European. The reason for that is probably that associated with the fact that 35% of African Americans have a Y-DNA that goes back to a European man, and 65% of them have Y-DNA that goes back to an African man. And that is a vestige of the slave trade. On his mother's side, he's met with Professor Dan Bradley in Dublin, and they both come to the conclusion that this probably represented an indentured servant, that his mother's line actually goes back to an indentured servant who was in America many, many, many years ago. So that just gives you an example of how testing just one line doesn't give you the whole story. Tracing deep and recent ancestry, the test that you would actually use is the mitochondrial DNA test. The cheapest is $59, which is what, about 35 pounds or so. And that is a fairly basic test, but it would actually help define your haplogroup and tell you if your direct female line, your mother's line, goes back to an African woman, European woman, Native American woman, etc. Most people here, it'll go back to a European woman. And it'll also tell you the route that your particular genetic signature took out of Africa. You can also upgrade to the mitochondrial full genomic sequence test for $199. I think we've got a special discount for $179 for the North of Ireland Family History Society. And it helps define the sub-branch of your haplogroup. Now, that's something that you might be interested in doing. I haven't done it because it's not something that particularly interests me. So if you were interested in your mother's line, I would just recommend you go with a cheaper test. The interesting thing about this, it can also be used for recent ancestry. Now, here is an example of Richard III. And you probably have heard this story because it's been in the media for the last year, 2, 3 years. Richard III was found in the car park. The king in the car park. He was found in the car park of Leicester Social Services Department. Typical social workers. They left the king in the car park. They did a DNA analysis on the remains they used one of his molar teeth, and they matched it with a living descendant, this chap here called Michael Ibsen. And he is descended along the direct female line from Richard III's mother. So Richard III's mother was Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, and she passed her mitochondrial DNA on to Anne of York. She passed it on to Anne of St. Leger, and she passed it on to her daughter Catherine, Barbara, Margaret, Barbara, 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 Barbara. This family was just lazy. Anne was a very welcome child. Charlotte, Muriel, Joy, and finally Michael Ibsen. So the mitochondrial DNA of Michael Ibsen is a direct match for Richard III. So over 500 years, that mitochondrial DNA has been passed from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter to daughter. Daughters pass it on. It gets passed on to the son, but the son cannot pass it on himself. So it always stops at the son. So we were very lucky to find Michael Ibsen because he is the end of the line. If he was a woman, then he could pass it on to his children. But because he's a man, he cannot. So by comparing his DNA with that of the remains in this king in the car park, we were able to conclude that on the balance of all the evidence, this was probably Richard III. So this is an example of how mitochondrial DNA could actually help your family tree research. If you think that your direct female line goes up to a common ancestor with somebody else's direct female line, then doing a mitochondrial DNA test and getting an exact match would help confirm it. It would make it 99.9% probable. Now, the other type of test for tracing deep and recent ancestry is the Y-DNA test, and the cheapest one is the $59, again about £35. It's the Y-DNA 12 test. They just look at 12 markers. Again, it's a fairly basic test. It will define your haplogroup, and that, in other words, which branch of the human Y-DNA haplotree you sit on. And it tells you if your direct male line, your father's line, goes back to an African, Native Indian, or European man. And again, most people here in the room, it would go back to a European man. Now, you can upgrade it to the Y-DNA 37 test, this one here. And that would be essential, really, if you wanted to investigate your particular surname and join a surname project, okay? There's about 7,000 projects with family tree DNA, and the majority of them are surname projects. So there's about 5,000 surnames in the family tree DNA database that are currently the topic of ongoing research by voluntary project admins. and we'll look at some of them in a while. Also, the Y-DNA37 will help define the sub-branch of your haplogroup, and it'll suggest a particular ancestral geographical region. If you do further SNP marker testing on top of that, you can refine it even more. And let's look at how Y-DNA can be used for recent ancestry. And this is where we get more into family tree research in the last 1,000 years or so. This is the front page of Family Tree DNA, and this is where you put in your surname. If you just do a search for your surname and see if it's there, then it will come up with whether or not there are other people in the database with your surname. The other thing that you can do is simply Google FTDNA and your surname, and that should come up as well. But I put in one of my surnames, and here it is here. It's Spearin, is one of my ancestral names. And it's come back and it's told me that there are 6 people called Spearin who are currently in the database. That's the surname results. But there's also project matches here, and there's a Spearin surname project with 34 members. So Spearin is probably only one of the variants in this particular project. Spearing, Sperrin, Sperring, etc. These are variants that are not included in the surname search, but are also included in this particular project here. So if I click on that, then I'll get information about that particular project. And we'll talk about that project later on, because that is one of my projects, and I'll give you an example of how it's run and what you can actually deduce from a surname DNA study. Now, these are the surnames in the Ulster Heritage Project. I don't expect you to read them. It's just to show you that there are a ton of surnames that are currently being researched in Northern Ireland, and one of your names might be up there. So if you do the DNA test, make sure you join the Ulster Heritage Project. I was in touch with Barry McCain before coming here to speak, and he's very, very enthusiastic about welcoming you into his project. And like I say, he's done a lot of work. Himself and John Kane have done a lot of work in getting the North of Ireland's DNA mapped out in this project. But let's look at the Spearin surname project. And this is one of my particular family lines, and it's really to give you an indication of the practical application of DNA to a particular surname. And we have a project website, and we have a project page on Family Tree DNA that lists and compares the various members' DNA signatures so that you can compare and see who is related to who. Now, it all started about 6 years ago or so. I was Googling the name Spearin online, and I came across Bob Spearing, and he's a train driver from New Jersey, and I wrote to him and said, do you know where the Spearins came from? And he wrote back a 4-page email which told a fascinating story. He said that he had found these wills dated from 1719 and 1726, and based on these wills of Matthew and Luke Spearin, he was able to put together a rough family tree of these early Limerick Spearins. They had married into the Hartwell family, and the Hartwell family were mayors of Limerick. And I thought, well, this sounds good so far. It's nice to be associated with landed gentry. And apparently, the Hartwells were granted large tracts of land in Limerick for their services to Charles II in his fight against Oliver Cromwell. Now, the children of this union were called Hartwell Spearin. George Hartwell Spearin, Charles Hartwell Spearin, Hartwell Thomas Spearin, etc., etc. And that was very common for people to combine the surnames of the mother and the father. And also, we found that of all the Spearin families we've managed to identify worldwide, 24 out of the 236 have the surnames Hartwell Spearin in their trees. So these 24 at least can probably claim that they can jump back in time to these wills from the early 1700s. Now there's a sliver of evidence that suggests that, and it's written by Sir Thomas Beetham, there's a sliver of evidence that suggests that these Hartwell, these Spearins, came from London where there were goldsmiths. And these goldsmiths were actually involved in the plantation of Ulster in 1609 and were responsible for the new buildings area just south of Londonderry. Excuse me. I have the floor plans of the houses that these Spearans lived in London in the late 1500s, early 1600s. There's a ton of information about them. And I think that's what you find with family tree research is that there's lots of information, and then there's no information, and then there's lots of information, and then there's no information. And these Spearans are just buried underneath the Gherkin in London, near St. Andrew Undershaft. There's also a link with Cambridge, where in 1534, King Henry VIII gave a license to print to a Nicholas Spearan, who was one of the first 3 printers of the Cambridge University Press. And he came from a family of bookbinders from Flanders. So that brings us back even to continental Europe in the 1400s. And this Nicholas Spearan was best friends with Erasmus, arguably the most intelligent philosopher that Europe has ever produced. I so badly want to be connected with this family. But does DNA tell us anything? Well, I'm not a Spearan, I'm a Gleason. So I had to go back to my great-great-great-grandfather, and I had to trace a direct male line down to the present day. And I found my 3rd cousin once removed. And he happened to be very friendly with my best friend that I lived with on the same road for years and years and years. So he introduced us, and my 3rd cousin once removed agreed to do a DNA test. So the first test to come back was this test here, and it just gave us a genetic signature. And what we're looking at here is, if you imagine the Y chromosome on its side with all the various markers up here at the top, and then the value for each of these markers is written below each of the corresponding markers. So here are the values for each of the markers. Several other people tested, and lo and behold, all of the markers were identical in all of these initial people, apart from this one here, which is indicated by a little purple color. And this just indicates that these people were very close matches. Now that was interesting because even though they could trace their ancestors back to Limerick, they came from New Jersey, Ontario, Australia, Limerick, Dublin. I got my 3rd cousin once removed to test, and his came back, and he was an exact match. He was an exact match to people called Spearing, Sperring, Sperrin, and none of them had the same spelling that we did. So their surname had changed over time, and if it wasn't for this, I would have said, we're not related at all, I'm not even going to bother going down that road of inquiry. More people were tested, and more people matched. So the DNA testing brought together lots of different families from all 4 corners of the world, and we all managed to trace ourselves back to Limerick, but we couldn't go back any further than about 1800 in any of our family trees. None of us have a documentary line that goes all the way back to the 1700s and 1600s. And more people were tested, and they didn't match. And these are called, well, either because these are completely different families, and they're not related to our Limerick Spearans at all, or these are what's called non-paternity events. Now, when I heard the term non-paternity event, 3 thoughts came into my head. The first thought was the Immaculate Conception. The second thought was, do they still do that? And the third thought was, no. So, non-paternity event could be a secret adoption, it could be an infidelity, an out-of-wedlock birth, or it could be a legal name change. So, there's various things that it could be, and it's not always infidelity. Some of these are bound to be a totally different family completely. So, for example, the English Spearings, they probably are not, or some of them are probably not related to our Limerick Spearings, but it's difficult to know. And further DNA testing is going to help solve that problem. The interesting thing about everybody in this early Limerick group is that they belong to haplogroup I2b1, and here is a distribution map of I2b1, and one of the areas of highest concentration of I2b1 is right beside Flanders. So it's an interesting supportive piece of evidence, but it doesn't prove anything per se. but it is interesting in that it supports this idea that the Sperens originally came from Flanders. So, what has DNA testing helped us? It has actually helped confirm the theory. Here are the families of the various people in the group. This is my family here, and this is me down here. This is my cousin who tested. And everybody has a brick wall in their documentary research. Then we have about 3 generations missing before we get to these early Limerick Sperens, and we have these wills that talk about them marrying into the Hartwell family. And then we have the London Sperens, which we have about 3 generations of data on. And then we have the Cambridge Sperens, which go back to about 1495, and then possibly back into Europe after that. So it's told us that we're all definitely related. And here are the results of these groups. This particular family here is not related genetically. It may be that they're a non-paternity event, or it may be they're from a completely different family. It's also told us that we definitely share a common ancestor. And because of the closeness of the match, and most people are either exact matches or differ from other people by a value of 1, then we'll probably have a common ancestor in the last 300 to 400 years. It points to these early Limerick Sperens in the will as the possible candidates. It also tells us that because some of the people we match have Hartwell Speren in their family trees, you can see these people here have Hartwell Speren, but because everybody is genetically related to the Hartwell Speren branch, we can jump back to the early 1700s because of that. The other thing we still have to fill out these 3 generations between the brick wall that occurs in all of our family trees and these early Limerick Sperens, and we still need to ratify this slim link between the Limerick Sperens and the London Sperens that Sir William Beetham has unearthed. We're also possibly related to the Cambridge Sperens, but that requires further research, and we might be related to other English and European Sperens. So, in terms of the future, it would be nice to test all identified 236 branches of the Speren family tree. It would be nice to build a mutation history tree, which is like a family history tree, except you're using mutations and grouping people with the same mutations closer to each other. Because people who share the same mutation are likely to be more closely related to each other than they would be to other people in the group who don't share the same mutation. So you can still get some further information from looking at these mutations within the group. It would be nice to document each tree of all 236 branches and to test more English and European Sperens to see if we can establish a link with England and to establish a link with Europe. So that is the Speren Surname DNA project, and that's going to be very, very similar to other Surname DNA projects as well. The last type of DNA, and we'll finish in about 10 minutes, is autosomal DNA. And this can tell us several things. It can tell you your ethnic makeup. It can establish links with long-lost cousins. It can tell you what % Neanderthal you are. And it can also ascertain your medical risk. But the one that you do with family tree DNA will only give you your ethnic makeup and long-lost cousins. It doesn't do percentage Neanderthal, and it does not do medical risk either. And autosomal DNA will bring you back about 5 to 7 generations, about 200 to 250 years from your year of birth. So that would be around about 1700. So if you want to connect with distant cousins with whom you share a common ancestor who lived around about 1700 or thereafter, then the autosomal DNA test is the one to do, and the one that family tree DNA offer is called the Family Finder test. If you do the Family Finder test, you should also upload your results to GEDmatch. This is a free website. It's run voluntarily by 2 people, therefore it's very slow, but it does allow you to compare your autosomal DNA results with the results of other people who have tested with other companies. So Ancestry, 23andMe, people who've tested with those companies can upload their data here if you test with family tree DNA, you can upload your data here as well, and you get a chance to compare your DNA results with a much larger database as a result. So that's GEDmatch. Now, one of the first things that the autosomal DNA testing will do is it'll tell you your ethnic makeup. So here is mine with family tree DNA, with this one is 23andMe, this one is Geno2, and this one, that one is Ancestry, this one is 23andMe. And you can see that I'm 99.8% European. And probably most people here will have the same kind of result, but you can see that it breaks it down into British and Irish, Scandinavian. I'm 0.1% sub-Saharan African. So somewhere about 500 years ago, there's an African prince or an African princess somewhere in my ancestry. I so badly want to find out who that person is. Most people here, their ethnic makeup will be European, and it won't be that exciting. But you never know. If there's some Spanish in people, the Spanish, of course, were the first Muslim country in Europe, because the Moors came up and they took over the southern half of Spain, and Spain, of course, traded with the west coast of Ireland. So we might actually find that Moorish DNA has moved up to the west of Ireland and has got into some of the people here in this room today. So that would be a very interesting find. For comparison purposes, this would be the ethnic makeup of an average African-American man. So again, a very mixed bag. What you find here is that 51.8% is sub-Saharan African, 16% would be East Asian or Native American, and 0.5% Arab, and 28% European. So we've got African, European, and then Native Indian. So that would, this can be very, very helpful for people of mixed ethnic ancestry who are researching their family tree, because you can even break this down by chromosome. So if you match somebody with a DNA segment on a particular chromosome, you'll be able to tell whether that's African, European, or Native Indian. So it can be very, very useful for people of mixed heritage. This doesn't show up very well, but the people of the British Isles project has been running in the UK for the last 4 or 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. And the Irish DNA Atlas project is also running in Southern Ireland. Now, what this has done is that it's been able to identify subgroups of people within the UK that belong to particular parts. So, for example, if we look at this island up here, there's the North Island and the South Island. I always forget, this is the Shetland. There's North Shetland and South Shetland? Or am I thinking of North Orkney and South Orkney? Which one? Orkney, right, okay, so the Orkney's up here. There's a clear genetic demarcation between the North Island and the South Island. And you'd think, well, why? There's only a mile between the two of them. The answer is actually in the land ownership. People on the North Island were not allowed to own land on the South Island way into the 1900s. So for hundreds of years, you had a separation of peoples between the North and South Islands, as a result of which they developed differing genetic signatures. And the same is true of a lot of places throughout the UK, and they've managed to identify various subgroups. There's a very clear demarcation between Devon and Cornwall, for example. Now, the good news is that this is also being done in Ireland as well. The Irish DNA Atlas is doing Southern Ireland, the people of the British Isles Project is doing Northern Ireland, and the two of them are combining their efforts. So within the next 5 years or so, just by doing an autosomal DNA test, you'll be able to be told, you have got people from Cork, you also have ancestors from Antrim, you also have ancestors from the Outer Hebrides. Now go and find them. So, very exciting time ahead for autosomal DNA. The last thing that autosomal DNA does is connect you with long-lost cousins. Now, here's me down here. I've done the autosomal DNA test. That allows me to go back about 5 to 7 generations, say to about 1765. I've also tested my dad. which pushes us back an extra generation. And I've tested my maternal aunt, which allows me to go back an extra generation on my maternal side. So those are the three main people that I've tested in my family with the Family Finder test. And these are the kind of results that you'll get on your personal web page. You will have a list of your matches here on the side, and I've anonymized or privatized them. You also have the range, the relationship range. So this person here, this person called Haddon, is reckoned to be my second to fourth cousin. And this person called Swords down here is reckoned to be my second to fourth cousin. It also tells you the total amount of DNA that you share in a unit called centimorgan. So I share 61 centimorgans with Haddon, I share 45 centimorgans with Swords. It also gives you a list of ancestral surnames that these people have entered into their personal web page. So just by looking through the surnames, you might be able to identify a surname from your own family tree. And that will serve as the focus for the initial contact with the person. I see that you have a Glennon in your family tree, so do I. Let's explore and see if we actually are connected via our Glennon lines. Now, the way to analyze the autosomal DNA matches is really in a four-step process. And I've got a video up on YouTube that explains it in a lot more detail, but I'll just run through it very, very briefly here today. Step one is, where does the common ancestor sit? CA means common ancestor. And it just means positioning the common ancestor on your family tree. So if you're told that you're second to fourth cousins, well, second cousins would share common great-grandfather or great-grandparent, and fourth cousins would share a great-great-great-grandparent. So just that allows you to position the common ancestor on the family tree. Typically, it tends to be a little bit too close. The estimate is a little bit too close, so I would always add 1 or 2 generations further back. Step 2 is the common ancestor obvious? And this involves making contact with your match, and you can do that because they usually have a messaging function on the page. You then compare trees with your match and you collaborate. There's a huge amount of collaboration here. You will only really have success if you collaborate with other people. And it does mean sharing your family tree as well. So do make sure that living people have been privatized, and make sure that you're happy to actually share your ancestry with other people. You can do a variety of different steps to eliminate non-contenders. And again, the video that I have on YouTube will explain this in a lot more detail. But for example, if you've tested somebody on your maternal side or your paternal side, say a cousin, any matches that you and your cousin match have to be on that particular side of the family. So you can rule out 50% of your ancestors as the likely candidate for a common ancestor with your match. You can narrow down to a specific common ancestral couple if you test, for example, a second or a third cousin. A match that you share with them must triangulate with that particular common ancestral couple that you share. A match on the Y or X chromosome, sorry, let me go there, yeah. A match on the Y or mitochondrial DNA, a match on the X chromosome again narrows it down to specific ancestral lines. And you can also look at ethnicity, nationality, geographic location. Locations and surnames are really what you're looking for when you are comparing your trees with other people. And this can even be done with your DNA. You can actually identify the ethnicity of specific chromosomes in your DNA. And then phasing your grandparents is possible as well, a very convoluted process. Any of these can take you hours, weeks, and months of happy research. So there is a health warning with this. It does become rather addictive. And then step 4 is working with small related groups, because you may match someone, but if you look at all of the people that you match in common with each other, you may find that there's maybe 5 or 10 people that appear in your list of matches and the other person's list of matches. And by collaborating with that group of people, you can narrow it down even further where the common ancestor is likely to sit. To show you a practical example of how autosomal DNA has helped my own family tree research, I'd like to talk to you about the mystery of the wedding memento. And this is the story of Ruby Kathleen Gleason. And several years ago, this bookmark fell out of my dad's grandfather's papers as he was going through them. And he looked at it a little bit closely and thought, actually, it's not a bookmark at all, it's a wedding memento. And it actually says, David Patterson, Ruby K. Gleason, married at Ballymena, the 23rd of March, 1893. So he didn't think any more of it, but he showed it to me at one stage and said, look, I'll set you a challenge. Go and find out who this person is. So I said, okay, let's meet up with your first cousin and see if she knows who this Ruby Kathleen Gleason is. And Dad's first cousin said, no, we never had anybody in the family called Ruby. Really? So she said, she's not one of ours. Put her in the shoebox and shove her under the bed. Now, I wasn't happy to relegate Ruby Kathleen Gleason to the shoebox of obscurity, as I call it. So I went on a little bit of a search. The first thing I did was I did a Google search for Ballymena. And it turned out that it's in the middle of the Australian desert. Surrounded by nothing, on the brink of man-eating koalas, mosquitoes, and my personal favourite, sharks with frickin' legs. So, number one, what were they doing getting married in the middle of the desert? And number two, how did the wedding memento end up on the other side of the world in my dad's grandfather's papers? So, I wrote off to Australia and I tried to find their wedding certificate, their marriage certificate. And I was surprised to find that Ruby's parents were John and Anne Gleason. And that was amazing because my great-great-grandparents are John and Anne Gleason. Not only that, but Ruby came from Longstone. And Longstone, Tralee and Killascully are the townlands that all of my great-grandfather and his siblings were born in. So John Gleason was a hotel or a farmer, depending whether you believed her marriage certificate or her death certificate. My John Gleason was a labourer. He'd never set foot in a hotel in his life, so there was a little bit of a disparity there. She was born around about 1872, 1869, which kind of corresponded with the birth of my great-grandfather's three sisters, Catherine in 1868, Bridget in 1872, and Winifred in 1877. Now, from her death certificate, we learned that she came to Australia around about 1886. And that kind of coincided with the death of my great-great-grandfather in 1885. He dies, he leaves a young family behind, the children have to make their own way. And so she comes over to Australia in 1886. It's possible. We also have this family lore that Timothy and Winifred had gone over to Australia, and Winifred had a daughter who was a famous concert pianist or a singer. Now, it took me 2 years. I put Ruby Kathleen's tree up on Genes Reunited, and 2 years later, I got in touch with one of her descendants, her grandson, and he was in his 80s. And we struck up an email conversation, and he gave me some background information that he had. The fact that she came over to Australia with her uncle and aunt and lived in Sydney and made the long trek from Ballymena all the way to Sydney, which took her 2 days, and because it was so expensive, only she went and none of the other family went. And she had a brother who went to the US and played baseball very successfully and sent her a watch with an engraving on the back of it, and they can't find the watch. But Ruby Kathleen had a daughter who was an excellent musician and excelled at violin. So there was so many interesting parallels between the two families, but there was nothing definite that could say, yes, these two families are definitely related. So what we did is we convinced Alan to do a DNA test. Now my dad had already done his, and that would tell us whether Martin, my great-grandfather, and Ruby were in actual fact brother and sister. So if they were brother and sister, then they would have shared 50% of the DNA. If they were first, and then if Dad and Alan who are second cousins, they should share about 3.125% of their DNA. And that's just the way that DNA is transmitted. It halves every time, because you get 50% from your father, 50% from your mother. So, and those are the percentage ranges we would expect. So the results came back, and they showed that Dad and Alan shared 2.6% of their DNA in common with each other, which is well within the percentage range you would expect, and the DNA confirmed that the most probable relationship between Dad and Alan was second cousins. So this was an example of how DNA can help support your documentary research. Me and Alan share 1.5% of our DNA in common, and again, it is within the amount that you would expect. So, what has autosomal DNA testing told us? Firstly, that Dad and Alan are definitely genetically related and the best fit as second cousins. It's confirmed a suspected relationship with 99% probability. But many unanswered questions remain, and DNA helps focus our further research. Which of the sisters became Ruby Kathleen? Or was there another sister that we were never aware of? Ruby Kathleen has been saved from the shoebox of obscurity, and we have now new cousins in Australia, and they have new cousins in Ireland. And this was done at a very opportune time because we've been keeping in touch, usually around Christmas, and unfortunately Alan passed away in October. So it was good that we were able to confirm this relationship before he passed away. It would have been much more difficult afterwards. So autosomal DNA can answer specific questions, it can confirm two people are related, and it can help focus research. It can be a useful extra tool. Now, there are limitations to DNA testing. It's not a substitute for documentary research, just an extra tool. The costs used to be quite high, but it really has come down a lot in recent years. For the autosomal DNA test, it used to cost $999, now it costs $99. So the prices are coming down all the time. People do complain that they have difficulty understanding the results. They can sometimes be too technical, which is why it is so important to join ISOG, to join the Facebook groups, to join the mailing lists and get as much support as you can. There are always privacy and data protection issues that people bring up from time to time. There may be legal implications as well. If you're a millionaire, then maybe you should think twice about doing a DNA test publicly. NPEs, adoptions, illegitimities, other surprises, these can happen, and they do happen. Roughly about 2% of all live births are non-paternity events. The matches, where do they come from? The databases that we use in these companies. Family Tree DNA, the database is 70% US. Ancestry DNA, it's 99% US. And which company to test with, because the companies don't talk to each other, that's always going to be an issue. But the fact that there are public databases like GEDmatch, which I've spoken to you about, means that we can find a way of actually comparing our DNA to people who've tested with other companies. So the most popular tests at Back to Our Past event in Dublin, which is this one up here, and the Who Do You Think You Are event in London, based on 113 tests in Dublin and 550 tests in London. About a third of people went for the Y-DNA test. About a third of people went for the mitochondrial DNA test, but the majority of people, both in Dublin and London, went for the family finder test, the autosomal DNA test, largely because these people are more interested in breaking down brick walls in their family trees, and the family finder test is probably the most appropriate to do so. The Y-DNA test is very, very important for surname studies. So I'd just like to finish by saying, or by quoting from an email that I received last year from a chap who said that his 84-year-old mother had recently done the DNA test. Now, she was adopted, and when the results came back, it allowed them to focus their research, and they managed to get in touch with a cousin of her mother's who was living in Australia. And that cousin had a letter that she had kept from the 60s, the 1960s, which explained about her mother and told her a lot about her family. So the cousin agreed to send her the letter, and the letter duly arrived, and in the letter was a photograph. So can you imagine what it feels like at the age of 84 to see your mother for the first time? And that's her there, Phyllis Ann Cartwright. The reason why they wrote to me is because I'm one of the closest matches on the other side of the family, on her father's side of the family. So I'm working with this woman and her son now to find out who her father was. And the answer to the mystery in her family tree lies in my family tree, and the DNA has actually pointed us in that direction. So to quote what this woman said, "You never know what you will find." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind attention. Now, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. We have some roving microphones. There's one over here, and there's another one, I think, down there on the... Oh, we can use this one here, actually. Here's one here, Alan. So, any questions? Now we have a question up here. Try and get the microphone to you.
Hello.
Aha, hello.
It's my understanding that if you have results of the 3 tests, my DNA or some the phenotype side, that there's no value unless these other people have done a test on their side, because it's all based on comparison.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to know the size of the database of the company you're testing with. With Family Tree DNA, they have a database of 600,000 people. So your results will be compared with all 600,000 of those people already in the database.
So as time goes on, there's better chance of finding a match.
As time goes on and more people join the database, then the chances of finding a match increase. Now, of course, it would be, the best situation would be is if they pooled all the data from all of the companies into one massive database. That would allow you to compare. They don't do that at the moment, and they probably never will for commercial reasons. But if you upload your data to GetMatch, that is a free, voluntary, public database where anybody from any company can upload their data for free, and then you can compare yourself with other people from other companies. We have a question here.
Thank you. When you get your results, how do they come? When you talk about your uploading your data to a website or to a project or whatever, is it downloadable onto the chip?
Yes, absolutely. What you'll actually get is an email. So, for example, if you test with any of the companies, you send it off to the lab. First of all, they send you a kit. We've got kits here today, so if you wanted to test with Family Tree DNA, you could do that tonight. Have your cheek swabbed, put it in the envelope, send it off to the lab. As soon as they receive it in the lab, they will process it and send you an email immediately saying, "We have received your kit, your DNA is being processed, and we have set up a personal web page for you." They will send you a user ID and a password, which you then log in with. So you just click on login, put in those details, your personal page comes up. On that personal page, you put in your personal details, as many of them as you want. You can put in the surnames in your family tree. You can upload a GEDCOM, which is one of those files that, it's a family tree file, or you can put a link into your online family tree. So you can put in as much information about your ancestry as you want to, that you think is going to help people identify whether or not there is an ancestral link with your particular family. So you can do all of that while you're waiting. And then after about 6 to 8 weeks, your results will come through, and they will send you another email to say, log into your personal web page, your results have come through, have a look. And then, depending on what test you've done, those results will be available for you to see on your own personal web page. There's a question up here at the back.
Most people work online. Is there another way of sending a DNA to the right back again?
Is there another way of sending DNA in?
Yeah, to get the results, they're usually sent online. If someone hasn't been into computers or that, is there another way of getting results?
Well, you would have to go to your grandson or granddaughter because they know all about computers.
I just thought of a point, so it's all online.
It is all online, yeah. You would actually have to go to a family friend who knew about computers so that they could show it to you.
So we can get a test tonight. How long does it take to take the test, and what's the process?
The process for taking the test is very simple. It's just like a cheek swab, so it would be 5-10 minutes of filling out the form, swabbing the cheeks, and then we would leave the envelope with you to put a postage stamp on, and that would be £3.80, I believe. That goes off to Texas. Then about 6 to 8 weeks later, you would actually get an email saying you have got your results, log in, and they'll be waiting there for you on your own personal webpage.
And the payment for that test?
It depends really on which one you want to do. The cheapest test is $59, which is what, £35. Add the £3.80 for the stamp. You will be charged in dollars, so there will be a conversion rate on your credit card of about £2 to £4. Depends which credit card company you use. So the cheapest test would be either the Y or the mitochondrial DNA for $59, the basic test. The next one up would be the Family Finder, which is the most popular one that allows you to connect with all of your ancestral lines. That's $99, which is about £85. And then if you wanted to do the Y-DNA 37 test, which would be important for surname studies and tracing your surname, then that will cost $129 here tonight, $139 tomorrow if you are a member of the North of Ireland Family History Society, and $149 at any other time if you buy it through one of the other projects, like the Ulster Heritage Project, for example. Normally it would cost $169, so the price you'd get for tonight would be $129, a saving of $40. A question down here?
Yeah, just a quick question on
Here's the microphone coming for you.
question on the security of the actual DNA itself. What assurances are there that the actual DNA will be secure, or who's got access to it, or is it likely that whoever gets hold of your DNA, they might sell it on to other sources?
Well, the various companies have various privacy policies that they have advertised on their websites, number one. There's also there's a European law that they comply with, which again is, it's kind of like the ISO quality standard. So they actually meet European regulatory requirements for privacy, for security, for confidentiality. There are always going to be those concerns in terms of the actual DNA that you're giving. So for example, the Y-DNA test, it only looks at a certain number of markers. It doesn't look at the entire Y-DNA chromosome. What anybody would do with that data is difficult to know because it only represents about less than 2% of your total DNA. So when we say that that you're getting a DNA test done, it's actually not looking at every single marker on your DNA, it's looking at only a small percentage of your total number of markers available. and that small percentage is not something that people could really do anything with. So, for example, one question that comes up from time to time is, if somebody gets hold of my DNA results, for example, an insurance company, would they refuse me insurance on the basis of my DNA results? Well, the only people that measure medically significant DNA markers are 23andMe, and their business is suspended on that particular area for now. All of the other companies, Family Tree DNA, Geno2, Ancestry, and Britain's DNA, they don't actually measure medically relevant markers on your DNA. They only look at ancestry informative markers. So they're just looking at markers that inform you about your ancestry. So there's no medically relevant information in your DNA test.
Same for criminal identification.
Same for criminal death. Well, we were chatting about this earlier on, actually, because I'm not entirely sure whether the DNA tests they use for criminals or criminal detection are the same as the ones they use for ancestry. I don't think they are. I think there are subtle differences. So, and that's again another interesting question. If
That's because if you use it, you could charge you, you could charge your brother, your uncle, your cousin, who all have the same DNA. Not selective.
if it was a Y-DNA test, then certainly that could possibly be the case. That, but again, it depends whether they are looking at the same markers in their database as they would be in the general public database. The other thing that you can do is if you don't want your DNA results to be made publicly available, then you can actually privatize your personal details, and you can privatize the DNA so that it's only visible to you. You won't be able to link up with any cousins because it's not actually going to be compared with anybody else, but they will just send you your DNA results as they are. You wouldn't be able to do much with them from an ancestry point of view, but there are ways of making yourself as private as possible, and the various companies can have various means by which you can do so. So how much personal data you want to enter into the public database very much depends on your own particular choice. I'll go back a few slides just to show you the home page of that you'll get with Family Tree DNA, and particularly looking at the autosomal DNA. So here we go. These are my various matches here, and here is an email icon. If you press on that, then it brings up a message box, and then you can type a message to that person and it goes to them. So you will be able to make direct contact with that person just by clicking on the email icon there. And it's the same for Y-DNA test results as well. There's always a way of contacting whoever you match, as long, of course, as they have actually consented to being contacted.
What benefit, if any, is there of having your DNA tested? If, let's say, an immediate or a member of your immediate family has already had it done, and well, let's hope they are your brother or your sister. Is there any benefit in having that that's already been done?
Sure. Again, it very much depends on the type of test. So, for example, say I got my father to do the Y-DNA test. I should tell you that genetically he is my father. We did actually ascertain that when I got my family finder results back. It showed that we shared 50% of our DNA in common. So with the Y-DNA test, if you had tested your father, there would be no point in you testing because you inherited your Y-DNA from your father. If he had done the family finder test, then if you did the family finder test, what you'd get is that you would match, 50% of your matches would also match your father, because 50% of your DNA comes from your father, So presumably, roughly 50% of your matches will also match your father, and that will indicate matches on your father's side. But by process of elimination, the matches that you have that don't match your father have to be on your mother's side of the family. Okay? If it was, say, brother and sister did the family finder test, you've received this, you both have the same parents. You will have received 50% of your DNA from your father, 50% from your mother. Your sister will have received 50% from your father, 50% from your mother, but not the same 50% necessarily. You might have received markers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. She might have received markers 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So even though you have the same parents, you don't necessarily receive the same DNA, the same 50% from each parent. So in that situation, what you'd find is that you and your sister would actually have a lot of matches in common, but you would have matches that your sister didn't have, and she would have matches that you don't have. They would still be related to both of you, but you wouldn't have received the DNA segment that matches with those matches, if you see what I mean. There's a question over here. It does get very complicated, doesn't it?
If I have my DNA tested, how does it link back to my, 7 generation back ancestors who I don't have any record of their DNA? I don't see the link between, how do I link with them when I don't have any evidence of their DNA?
You don't have any evidence of their DNA, but other people in the database may very well be related to them. So, for example, because most of the database is US, we get a lot of people from the US saying, oh, we're a match. And that would be because we share a common ancestor, and on their particular ancestral path, their ancestors emigrated to the US. On my particular path, or your particular path, they stayed in Ireland. So the common ancestor would be before that emigration event, going all the way back maybe to 1700, 1750. So the way that DNA is passed on, 50% from your mother, 50% from your father, that means 25% from each of your grandparents, 12.5% of your DNA comes from each of your great-grandparents, 6% of your DNA comes from each of your great-great-grandparents, and so on. So the DNA that you possess today is actually contributed to by each of your ancestors going way, way back. But the proportion gets smaller the further back you go. Does that help to answer the question?
Not really, because I think about that king they found in the car park. They found his DNA, but I haven't got any DNA from my great-great-great-grandparents to link with me.
That particular case was we're looking at ancient DNA. And in Richard III's case, if Richard III, for example, had lived and had let's use a different example. Supposing he had a sister, and the reason why I say a sister is so that she could actually pass on the mitochondrial DNA. And she passes it on to her daughter, and then her daughter, her daughter, her daughter, her daughter, her daughter. Then what you'd find is that the two descendants would actually share the DNA. So we're not actually comparing your DNA with ancient DNA, we're comparing your DNA with living DNA, but the DNA in your situation and in your match's situation, both have been passed down to you by the common ancestor hundreds of years ago. So we're not looking at ancient DNA to prove that you are related to Richard III. We're looking at living DNA to prove that you're related to the Campbells from the lowlands of Scotland or something like that.
Another thing that's been complicated is you're talking with all your ancestors are not related, but they were great-great-grandparents or second cousins. Then you have a bit of an exception.
Well, in fact, my great-great-grandparents were John Gleeson and Anne Gleeson. So they could very well have been cousins. That would have been recorded in the birth records. There would have been a degree they would have written that degree in the church records. There wasn't any such entry in the marriage record of my great-great-grandparents. But if you do share cousins in your ancestry, then what you find is, of course, a degree of pedigree collapse as you go back. So instead of having 128 4 times great-grandparents, you maybe have 120, because 2 of them were cousins, or 4 of them were cousins to start off with. In that sort of situation, it happens a lot with endogamous societies, societies where there's a lot of intermarriage. So, for example, Roman Egyptian, Hindu castes, and particularly the Ashkenazi Jews. There's a lot of endogamy and a lot of intermarriage with cousins. And the result of that is that relationships seem a lot closer than they actually are, because you're genetically heavy with particular ancestral lines. So that's a very good point.
If the largest database is 605 names, what's the probability that one of us will find an answer to that?
Well, to give you an example, I have 300 matches in family tree DNA using the family finder test. My dad has slightly more than that. His second cousin also has around about the same 300 matches. So, and the majority of those matches are going to be distant, so fifth cousin or greater. This is from the first page of my particular results, and you can see that they list the closest relationships first. So I've got second, fourth cousins, an established second cousin twice removed, second, fourth cousin. I have about 4 or 5 second to fourth cousins. Then I have about 10 third to fifth cousins. And then I have about 20 fourth cousin or more distant. And then I have about 250 fifth cousin or greater.
I suppose you should answer a little bit differently. We might be just lucky. But I suppose you won't really know what percentage of people claim 0.
0.
In such a small, considering the population of the world, and the set of databases, it's quite small in today's databases. And so, so you can know that data, but I mean, if 90% of us did the DNA test and search the 61,000,
I would say that most people in this room will have about 300 matches on the family finder test, somewhere between 200 and 300 matches, because we are European. And most of the people that have done this test are European or have European ancestry. In fact, 70% of Americans, 70% of the database is American, means that you're largely looking at Americans who have European ancestry. And a lot of them will have British and Irish ancestry. So I think if you have European ancestry, you will roughly get 200 to 300 matches. With the Afro-Caribbean group that I'm working in the UK, Jamaica Family Roots, 2 matches, 5 matches, 7 matches. So 3 people have done the family finder test, and that's all they had. They had very, very few matches. And the matches that they did have were on the European side of their ancestry, not on the African side of their ancestry. They still found it very fascinating because the ethnic breakdown told them that they were, for example, 20% European, 80% African. That surprised some of them. But it also meant that the people that they matched had to be on the European side of their ancestry. So that gives you an idea of, depending on what ethnic group you come from, you get very, very different results on the family finder test. But I'd say everybody here, and because there was so much immigration to the US from Ireland over the centuries, most people here would have 200 to 300 matches. Now, I haven't had great luck with the family finder test just by what I call doing a fishing trip. So, for example, with this chap here, even though he's said to be my second to fourth cousin, still haven't been able to find that connection. Similarly, with this chap here, second to fourth cousin, haven't been able to find that connection. And that's largely because at that level, we're probably connected one generation, maybe 2 generations beyond the brick walls that I have in my family. And being American, a lot of the Americans will have a brick wall around about 1830 or 1850, where they know that their great-great-grandfather came from Ireland, but they don't know where in Ireland. So a lot of the time you end up perhaps with a possible location for the common ancestor, but you don't have a surname. And of course, surnames disappear with every generation, especially on the female side. So you're looking at 50% loss with one generation, 25% loss with the next one, it's down to 12.5% in the third one. So the surname disappears very, very quickly. So you're left looking at common locations.
Thanks very much.
It's me again. Just, which test would you recommend for general family history use? Which test? The family or the mother's DNA or the father's DNA?
I would go for the Family Finder. It's the one that allows you to have the most possibilities. And like you were saying, the more people that join the database, you will continue to get matches all the time. So, once you've done the test, there will be updates. You will be notified. A person matches you. Usually you can set the settings so that you can be notified by email when a close match comes in. So having your DNA there in the database means that as new people join, they'll be matched against yours, and if they are a close match, you will be notified of those results. So I think the Family Finder, and it is the most popular in Ireland and the UK, is probably the best one to do from a general family tree, family history point of view. It's also useful testing several members of the family, because then if you, say for example, you've got a brick wall on a particular area that you're particularly interested in. Say your father's father's father. So say your paternal grandfather. There's a brick wall there, and you're interested in finding out about that particular ancestor or that ancestral couple. If you were to test and then test another descendant in your family, say your first cousin or second cousin, who was also directly linked to that particular ancestor of interest, then any matches that you both share, you have to share through that ancestral line. The common ancestor has to be at that level or above that level. And that helps you really focus your research on that particular ancestral couple. So I think the Family Finder test is probably a very, very good general one. At $99, it's very reasonable. If you're interested in your surname, and you're specifically interested in researching your surname, then the Y-DNA 37. That would be the one to go for. So those would be my two top favorite tests, really.
Thank you.
Pleasure. We have a question from Sean down here.
Just to benefit some local information, particularly for one of the questions that came up behind me there. I tested Morris, as you know, 18 months ago at Who Do You Think You Are? And I also bought a kit for my mother at the same time, but I wasn't seeing my mother for 6 weeks. So by the same time I sent her kit off, it was 12 weeks in arrears to compare to mine. When the email came through in the morning to say her results have been analysed, the results were 1 generation, suggested relationship, parent to child. So that was an astonishing shock for me. But since we both had the autosomal, I've upgraded my mum's kit to the full mitochondrial sequence, and I've upgraded my own kit to the 111Y DNA marker. And the 111Y DNA marker immediately gave me results as close as Corlane, Ballymena, Bushmills, and Niswati. So that confirmed very much so my father's recollection that the Trainer family had been in North Antrim for about 200 years. But a few months into the analysis, and a few more matches are coming up, and I've been directly matched with trainers from Monaghan and Dundalk, which confirms what I had in the back of the mind, that we were descended from the trainer clan in North Monaghan. My mother's DNA on the mitochondrial shows a completely different pattern. A lot of European, Swedish, Germanic, Spanish, but concentrated on descendants in Pennsylvania. So that ties into me the migration pattern of Irish people to Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So, being as my mum was adopted at birth, a lot of homework on that particular case, but the regional and geographical locations to me have been priceless in terms of investment. The other thing I think it's wise to say to everybody is that with family tree DNA, that your kids, you only need to be tested once, and then you can upgrade to the other tests, and that it stays on record for 25 years. So you're going to go on getting your matches as long as you remember to update your email address for the next 25 years. So that's my little input to the event.
Thank you, Sean, that's great. No, absolutely. The fact that they keep your DNA on file means that if you do decide to have subsequent tests, you can upgrade and order new tests at any point in time. Great. Any other questions? Well, we will be hanging around for the next hour and a half or so to do some DNA pit swabbing. So if you do have any questions, you can always ask me. I'll be hanging around the tables here. And it just remains for me to thank all of the members of the Ballymena Northern Ireland Family History Society once again for organising this result. So could I ask you to give them a big round of applause? Oops. Do you want to try that? Hello? Can we have the microphone on? Oh, right, okay. Should be.
Hello.
There we go.
Folks, just to remind you that your admission tonight was £5 to come in. That got you your excellent talk here by Dr. Morris Gibson. It also enters you into a raffle for a few items that have been donated by local companies, and also got your bags. So to say, I'll maybe ask Morris to draw the first ticket for the book, which is Tracing Your Ancestors. So if you've got your ticket.
That's my name on it.
Pardon?
That's my name.
That's your name. Well, it's number.
Oh, it's number, oh. Okay, number 42. Number 42.
That's Eason's local bookshop who provided that. Number 42. You check your ticket. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I have number 42 here.
Next, there's a local photographer in Ballymena. He's also put a voucher in every one of your bags. There's £100 off if you want to go along with photographs. There's also a free 1 hour session and a free photograph. So maybe draw. It's local guy Rob McKay in Greenville Street.
And the number is 103. Oh, we have a video?
Yes, Maggie will get your name and address and the voucher, okay? And the last one, given the fact that it's family tree, we've got a local garden centre in Ballybourne, and they provided a voucher. So you can grow your tree in the garden if you can't trace it.
And this number is 55. Oh, yeah, we have a winner at the back.
Again, sir, if you want to give your name and details to Maggie here. Folks, just to thank again Morris for coming along tonight. I think we thoroughly enjoyed it. We show appreciation to Morris. Can I remind you also that we do have CDs on sale from the various meetings that we've had down through the year, and the last couple of years at £2 CDs to see the guest speakers. We're talking about anything from military history through to Brony, regards to history and ancestry. So a very good bargain, £2 each. The other thing is just to remind you, if you're thinking of the test, please come and see us and get your details. Thank you very much, David.
My brother's here, and we're part of a little surname.